Hello again, everyone, and no praises to the Most High, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And welcome again to another weekly Bible study in my New Testament is Fake series. You can find my teachings online at youtube.com for this series and other lessons I have on patreon.com. I'm just setting up Patreon now, trying to figure out how it all works. But I'm there with a couple videos already so far, and you can find me at twitter.com as well. Now, my lesson today that shows the error of what is New Testament in the Bible is titled Pre-Sacrificial Mutilation. And I want to go over some verses that I've used in recent lessons, and just so I can help you understand a little bit more for the searching ones of us, how the scriptures in the Torah actually show that the New Testament is fake, and that it is not according to what the God of the Torah says. Although the Torah has its own problems and is also not of the Creator, but I'm teaching this lesson from the point of view of the person who understands the Torah and who has been led to believe that the Torah is correct. But you are also taught that the New Testament is correct and that you should trust in Jesus for your salvation. See, the reason why I do it this way is because I left the Christian church and then I was taught that blacks are the Hebrew Israelites of the Torah. And so I believed that and went along with that for a short time. But then I was taught immediately as well that the New Testament Savior at Calvary was also the quote-unquote truth, and that we should receive him for our salvation. And after a little bit of time, I realized something is wrong. How could I have left the Jesus in the Christian church because I found a problem with him, and then come over into Hebrew Israelite teaching and saying that this same Jesus is all right? The only problem is that the Christians didn't understand him. And so what I need to do in order to understand him is to call him by a Hebrew name, and then I will understand him. So instead of calling him Jesus, I would call him any one of the many Hebrew names that were given to me. But I realized that just simply pronouncing his name in the Hebrew, and one can only guess which pronunciation is from God. But after doing all those many pronunciations, I realized the whole thing was just not true. Now, if you try to expose the entire Bible, you're going to reach some people. And if you just try to expose the New Testament alone, you will reach a different number of people. I realize that some people can get rid of the entire Bible, both Old and New Testament. But there are some who cannot give up the Old Testament or the Torah, but they can drop the New Testament because they see problems with the New Testament. So I keep my New Testament is Fake series and keep teaching on it because I really believe I should continue to do so. But I teach it from the point of view of the Torah observer to reach those who will be able to see from my arguments and from the scriptures that the New Testament is wrong, but are not able to see or to believe or understand that the Torah itself is a trick as well, being stolen from Egypt or from Africans. It's a whole African system described in the Torah. with a lot of deception and so on. But some people cannot go that far. So it's kind of like they say you give a baby, whatever. So I'm dealing here in this series with the New Testament, with the hopes that you can see something at least about the New Testament, and then you can make your way from there. Now, if I look here at John chapter 19, verse 1 and 2, as I talk about the pre-sacrificial mutilation that happened to the Lamb of Calvary, the human lamb, then it says here, then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers planted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. So they were flogging him, beating him, and so on. We know the whole crown of thorns bit and so on. So they beat him up real bad. I'm trying to show here that in the time of the Torah, when it was being lived, if that's even correct, the priests would not watch anyone damage the lamb that was about to be sacrificed on a high holy day. Like damage it the night before, the day before, or once they selected it, then they're just damaging it and so on, and then hand it over to the priest. And then the next day now the priest would be offering that up. No, because remember the Torah says the sacrifice cannot be mutilated in any way. It cannot be broken and stuff like that, and it must be perfect. So you can't treat the sacrifice like that before it's actually killed, because people will say, but his flogging and so on, Isaiah 53, he was wounded for our transgressions and so on. His flogging and so on was a part of the sacrifice. No, it was not a part of the sacrifice. That's a part of the deception. Because the sacrifice actually is the killing. When they were flogging him, remember, not everybody that was flogged was necessarily killed. So when they were flogging him, that's just another kind of hitting that they do to him and punishment and so on. But it is not the sacrifice. Right? So you might say, well, it still says he would be wounded and bruised and so on. So the flogging was still all right. But in the end, it would not be all right. Because even if you say Isaiah said in Isaiah 53, he was wounded for our transgression, so the flogging is wounded, and the crown of thorns piercing him and so on was wounding, it still puts him in a position where by the time the sacrifice is made on the actual cross itself, which is a killing because the sacrifice is to kill, then by the time that sacrifice happens, that sacrificial procedure or ritual happens, he was already mutilated, bruised. But the sacrifice, the Lord said, should not be bruised. It should be perfect. It should not be scarred, ripped up in the skin and so on. But the cat of nine tails, pieces of jagged metal or sheep bones at the end of the whip, end of a rope, would rip into his back, into his body and so on, and rip his flesh, tear his flesh as he screams out and so on, and blood everywhere. They're ripping up, they're damaging his body, right? That's the mutilation happening right there. That's sacrilege. So they're ripping up all of that stuff of the sacrifice. Can you imagine somebody in the days of the Torah doing that and ripping up the body of a sheep, of a lamb with a whip like that, and ripping the flesh like crazy, and leaving the lamb in all kinds of blood and so on, and then presenting that to the high priest to keep overnight, and then for him to pull that out on the next day, the high holy day, before the people to sacrifice it? No. Because it would be forbidden to offer a sacrifice like that. You cannot do anything prior to the actual sacrifice that damages or causes any kind of blemish on the lamb. That's Torah for you. So what they're teaching you in these Hebrew Israelite camps, that Isaiah prophesied and other prophets that he would be treated like this as a part of the sacrifice, is completely and 100% anti-kosher, it is anti-God, it is anti-human, because no human should have that done to them if they didn't do anything, and they say Jesus was perfect, so they say. And it should be anti-book. It should not be written in any book of salvation. That should be anti-religion, to have treated him like that. So these camps are not teaching you anything proper from God. You have never heard the word of God taught properly in any Hebrew Israelite camp that's teaching you to worship Jesus. You've never heard it. Now let's go on now. Actually, I wasn't going to read this part, but let me see, let me just run Isaiah 53 for those who, like maybe more New Testament, like coming out of the church, doesn't know Old Testament that much, although they would certainly know, I would think, Isaiah 53. Let me just try to read just maybe one or two verses or so from that. Isaiah 53 verse 1, Who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And so on. It goes on now. Let me see. Verse 5, But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we were healed. So, now, like I'm saying, if they said a part of his whipping and pushing the crown and bloodying him up and so on his head was a part of the whole sacrifice, that would be wrong. Because look, verse 5 says, But he was wounded. The Hebrew word for wounded, kalal, says to profane and to defile, to pollute, to desecrate. To desecrate. Like when they said Antiochus Epiphanes went into the temple in the intertestamental period, which is a period of about 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And he went in to the temple and smeared pig's blood all over the temple. And they said it was a desecration of the temple. So it's like when you do this to Jesus now and beat him up and bloodying him up like that, it's like you're causing a desecration right there. Now he has been defiled and polluted by the very blood and ripped up skin, ripped up body that he now has. He cannot present himself before God for any kosher Hebrew Israelite Torah Old Testament pure sacrifice. What happened at Calvary was nothing pure. It was an abomination. It was straight iniquity. It's not even just sin. It is iniquity, which is a level above sin. Alright? So if he is profaned and defiled and polluted, it could not have been by the flogging and the whipping, the scourging. Any kind of wounding or profaning and so on, if that's even correct, would have had to happen directly from the nails killing him. In other words, the nails sacrificing him to hold him up on the cross. Because any such wounding could only happen as a part of the actual sacrifice. It cannot happen before, because remember, the sacrifice is to kill. And when they were flogging him, they were not killing him. They weren't bringing on death. Because people are flogged and still lived. Some people were punished just by flogging, which was normal, but weren't necessarily slated for crucifixion. Didn't have that kind of judgment of crucifixion on them. So when they're flogging him, that's a punishment that they're giving him. But that kind of punishment went against the Torah that said, basically, with the understanding I'm applying here, that was saying in Isaiah 53 verse 5, that he would be profaned and defiled at the time of execution or crucifixion. Not prior to that, after he was arrested. Not prior to that. Because then, if he was profaned and defiled before the actual crucifixion at the time of the cross, then he would have been presented for the crucifixion already polluted and already defiled. Remember, the people were crying out to Pilate, crucify him, crucify him. So no matter how much they were trying to judge him and flog him and so on and ridiculing him and so on, it was not yet decided from the start that he should be crucified. That's why the people were crying out, crucify him. In other words, crucifying him was trying to get something done in the future of them saying that and crying that out, because it had not yet been stated that he should be crucified. They were trying to decide on it. But prior to that, then they started beating him up. So they were mutilating the sacrifice. This is pre-sacrificial mutilation of the sacrificial animal, which is forbidden by the Torah, forbidden by the God of Israel, forbidden by Levitical laws, without which you cannot see Jerusalem and you cannot go to heaven. You are not saved, you are not redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. And through this Mashiach at Calvary, no two nations of north and south are coming together as one stick joined together again, because that sacrifice at Calvary was defiled before the sacrifice took place. And the only reason they continued to let it take place was because the Israelites were not in charge or in control of the sacrifice at Calvary. The Romans were, because the Romans were already putting in high priests that they chose. So the high priest, the system was already corrupted by Romans, dipping into it and doing what they wanted to do. So the high priest system was no longer pure and kosher before the Lord. That means there is nothing going on that has anything to do with God or anything to do with an Isaiah 53 fulfillment or a fulfillment of any prophet in the Old Testament. New Testament is fake. Okay, now let's get another New Testament verse here. And to show you that how this was not orderly done, with them beating him up before and blooding him up and so on. And then they're going to present him as a nice, clean sacrifice at Calvary. That's just crazy, right? I'm going to show you that now as I read, but let me look up one other word first, just to show you what I mean by this whole sacrifice. Look at the word like zabak. H2076, used for sacrifice in the scriptures sometimes, right? It means to slaughter, to kill. So basically, like I've told you before, even when you are cooking food and you go kill an animal, you kill your rabbit or your chicken or your whatever you like to eat, that's a sacrifice that you're doing in your kitchen. A butcher performs a sacrifice in order to sell you the meat. The sacrifice is the killing. The sacrifice is not no whipping and bruising of Jesus while people are saying, crucify him, crucify him. Crucify him, crucify him clearly shows you that crucifixion had not yet been specified. It had not yet been granted. It had not yet been decided. So they're asking for it. Why? Because something else was being done to him. A flogging, a whipping. So they're saying, no, that's not enough. Do something else different that you are not doing now. Crucify him. In other words, sacrifice him. And then eventually it was said, okay, go ahead and do it then. Sacrifice him. And then because now it shifted to the sacrifice, then they stopped flogging and whipping him. Because now they're going to switch over to the sacrifice. They're going to switch over to sacrifice now, to zabak, to kill him. Because that's what sacrifice means from the Hebrew, to kill, zabak. So when it's saying here, Isaiah 53 verse 5, wounded for our transgressions, it's not saying there that they're killing him. But the wounding would have to then happen as a part of the sacrifice, directly as a part of the sacrifice by the nails going into his hand. Because what if he was flogged and so on? And then they said there, don't bother crucify him. We'll throw him in prison then for 5 years or something like that. Or we'll give him a few more flogging and then stop it there. We're not going to crucify him. He's learned his lesson, hopefully. We'll see if he transgresses in the streets again with his strange teaching and so on. And if he does it, then we'll crucify him. So if they had stopped him at flogging but not crucified him, would you then have said that the flogging from Isaiah 53:5 was the sacrifice, or was the crucifixion, was the wounding? No, because he was not sacrificed or killed, because they stopped it. You see that? Because that whipping was something different than the sacrifice. It was simply an additional thing that they were doing when you look back in hindsight. But the actual sacrifice was something that came later on, after the people pushed for the death penalty. Because now, remember, Pilate didn't want to give him the death penalty. Remember that he even washed his hands afterward and said, okay, I'm clean of this, you guys, it's all on you. Why? Because even in his mind, he was not sacrificing or killing Jesus. In other words, he was not fulfilling Isaiah 53 while he was having him flogged. There was nothing there that was saying he was trying to fulfill Isaiah 53, even unknowingly so, because he was not crucifying the man. He was not crucifying Jesus. He was just simply giving the flogging just to give the people something, hoping that they would just calm down and say, okay, because he knew he was a righteous man. So now, that's like a haphazard event going on right there still, right? But look at the orderly kind of stuff here now when Jesus himself is dealing with it. Luke 22 verse 19, and he took bread and gave thanks and brake it and gave unto them, saying, this is my body which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me. Notice the peaceful, orderly breaking of bread, which they say was symbolic of the sacrifice. Not no haphazard kind of out of line whipping and flogging and bruising of the sacrifice, and then he's going to be broken at Calvary. No. His skin might have been broken by the whips, but that is not the sacrifice, because the sacrifice is to kill, and he was not killed by the whipping. The nails killed him on the cross. Only at that time did he say, into your hands I commend my spirit. Why? He never said that before while being whipped and a crown being pushed on his head, because he knew he wasn't dying from that. But when the crucifixion came now, then he knew, now this is the sacrifice that's killing me. Because the rest that came before was just a punishment I was receiving for my teachings and so on. But the orderly stuff, breaking of bread with them and giving them to eat and so on, this is my body which was done for you, that's the orderly kind of stuff, which does not match the haphazard whipping and flogging, the out of line stuff that the Romans were doing to him, because they were not Israelites, and so they're not going to do anything orderly to match with how he is presenting how the stuff should have gone orderly. Orderly breaking of bread with them and saying, this is my body, would have been leading him up to the cross. Like if this was Israelites running the whole crucifixion and they knew they were performing fulfillment of prophecy for their own salvation that they wanted, they would have done it orderly to not anger the Most High and to not jeopardize their salvation that would come from the whole sacrifice. So they would have, in likewise, orderly took Jesus, if this was happening in Old Testament times, and lead him up nice and clean, make sure his garment is ready and clean and white and nice for the sacrifice, and brought him up before the other Israelites who would have been killing him, because I told you it is just wrong by Torah standards to have a heathen like a Roman kill the sacrifice and put the sacrifice to death. So they would have marched him up in Old Testament times and let another Israelite perform the killing of him by nailing him on the cross. Orderly, neat, and then when he died, they might have been saddled and whatever, but then it would have been done. They would have put him take him up off the tree, off the cross, and then wrapped him up nice and put him away. Orderly, just like in orderly in Luke 22:19, he brake bread with them. He took bread and gave thanks. That's neat and orderly. Because an Israelite would be doing it the way the prophecies say, or the way that makes sense. But what the Romans did, that was just haphazard stuff. That's no fulfillment of Isaiah 53 and verse 5. Look at another verse here. John 19, verse 1 to 2. Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers platted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. See, that's not killing. That's not killing. But now look here now. I told you already this was sacrilegious, right? Sacrilege from the dictionary means a violation or misuse of what is regarded as sacred. Sacrilege is the violation of or injurious treatment of a sacred object or person. This can take the form of irreverence to sacred persons, places, and things. And so on. You can look up that some more, right? So basically, something went wrong with this sacrifice here. But let's get the verse now from Leviticus chapter 22. Let's go down to verse 24 and 25. Ye shall not offer unto the Lord that which is bruised or crushed. You see that? So they already did that to Jesus by flogging him and putting the crown of thorns on him and bloodying him up and so on. Then they're going to offer that when it is now finally decided this will be the judgment. He should be crucified. So they did whatever to him. It doesn't matter that there's a short time between that flogging and bruising him and then deciding he should be crucified, or if there was a long time, like if they flogged him and so on and bruised him up and bloody him up, and then he sits in prison for 5 weeks, and then because the people were still pushing, then after 5 weeks they said, you know what, just crucify him and just get it over with. Give the people what they want. So then he would have had the markings from his body where the skin was being healed and so on, and after 5 weeks he's going to come with those blemishes in his body to be offered up. So it doesn't matter if it's just a couple hours or whatever, or within a day, or 5 weeks. He would then have blemishes on his body when it is decided after 5 weeks or more or so that he should then be offered. That would disqualify him from being a sacrificial animal based on Levitical laws. The New Testament again is fake, and it is destroyed again right here in this another lesson in this New Testament is fake series. There's no salvation in this Hebrew Mashiach. So it says, ye shall not offer unto the Lord that which is bruised or crushed or broken. These things happen to Jesus, right? Or cut. Neither shall ye make any offering thereof in your land. But they made the offering in their land in Jerusalem by the Romans doing it for them, which is a serious problem because the heathen cannot offer sacrifice for salvation for Israel. And it was the Romans who offered the sacrifice for Israel on Calvary's hill of sorrow. What part of this you're not getting? But they made the offering in their land in Jerusalem by the Romans doing it for them, which is a serious problem because the heathen cannot offer sacrifice for salvation for Israel. And it was the Romans who offered the sacrifice for Israel on Calvary's hill of sorrow. What part of this you're not getting? What part? You see? Now they're trying to duplicate my account just to confuse people because they know they cannot beat the arguments I'm making from the scriptures, so they're going to try and come at it another way. Just to show you that these scriptures are right on. The understanding of these scriptures are right on. You are being deceived in the Hebrew Israelite camps. And in Christian churches too. Verse 25, neither from a stranger's hand, in other words, neither from the Romans' hand or the Greeks' hands, shall ye offer the bread of your God. And Jesus said, I am the living bread that came down. Neither from the Romans' hands shall you offer the Jesus bread or the Messiah bread of your God of any of these, because their corruption is in them. He's saying that these people, being heathen in the mind of the Hebrews, are corrupt because they are heathen. They're godless in their practices and so on, the way they live. They do not live by Torah. That's how the Hebrews would have looked at them. So basically, the Israelite hearing that in the time of Moses, as they believe Moses wrote this, would have understood that God is saying through Moses, neither from a Torah-less hand, like the Romans eventually would find out, shall ye offer the bread of God, like the living bread, like the Messiah, because the corruption of the lifestyle of and belief of the Romans is in them. It's in their corruption is in their lifestyle and their beliefs and so on. and blemishes are in them. So you cannot let the blemished offer your sacrifice and nail your sacrifice on your tree, on your altar, which is not an altar, of an Israelite at least. Because Israelites did not offer their sacrifices on crosses. But why did they do it? The Romans do it in the New Testament because their thinking in religious matters that have to do with the Torah or with the Hebrew Israelites, their thinking was corrupt because they did not live by Torah themselves. That's why you got the Herods and all them trying to learn in the intertestamental period. They were trying to learn, coming up to the New Testament times, trying to learn the Torah of the Hebrews. Some of the history says. Because they didn't live by it before, so they didn't know it. And that's how they got in and figured it out and learned it. So then they started setting up the priests in the Israelite priesthood to corrupt it. But it was all a big lie anyway. Because the Torah itself is fake. And Moses didn't write any of this. But to keep it in line with this here, he's saying their corruption is in them. Because of their own beliefs and pagan practices, their real pagan stuff, and blemishes, it's in them. They shall not be accepted for you. So the sacrifice at Calvary goes against all that the Torah says. The sacrifice was not accepted by the Most High for any Israelite that was living back then, at the time of Calvary, or any Israelite living right now in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, and so on. The sacrifice was never accepted, so Jesus is not coming back for you. And Daniel's prophecy was not fulfilled by that non-kosher sacrifice at Calvary. So Daniel himself, either his prophecy was not fulfilled or he was a liar. And since it has been proved by many people that Daniel's prophecy is fulfilled in Calvary, that means Daniel was a false prophet. Daniel was a liar. Because the corruption was in the Romans and the Roman system that handled Hebrew Torah sacrifices, or sacrifice at Calvary. The corruption was in the ritual performed at Calvary by the Romans. So then the corruption was in the sacrifice itself. They corrupted the sacrifice, or the sacrificial lamb, who was Jesus, the Mashiach. So the whole system of Calvary was corruption, and the whole New Testament would then be corruption. Because what happened at Calvary was all a pre-sacrificial mutilation of the chosen Lamb of God. And I'm telling you once again that the New Testament is fake.